Many of you may recognise the name Hastein from the Last Kingdom, where he is painted as a cunning and self-serving Viking. Yet, the true story of Hastein is far grander, etched into the annals of history as the saga of a warrior whose ambition and prowess knew no bounds. Hastein was one of the most successful and infamous Vikings of all time, and was far more powerful than his portrayal in the Last Kingdom, although the two do share some characteristics. Hastein's life was a tapestry of conquest and daring exploits. Alongside the mighty Björn Ironside, he commanded a fleet that struck terror across the Mediterranean. In the land of the Franks, Hastein earned a fearsome reputation. In one such brutal battle, Hastein's Viking horde struck down the valiant Robert the Strong, a celebrated warrior who would become the ancestor of the King of the Franks, forever cementing Hastein's legend. Yet, his saga did not end there. The shores of England awaited his arrival, where he would meet his match in the form of Uhtred the Great, the noble King of Wessex. Hastein would come face to face with his most formidable adversary. The two would clash in battle, their wills locked in a fierce contest of strategy and strength. In time, they would parley, each trying to outmaneuver the other, but in the end, it was Hastein's treachery that would shine through, as he broke his word to Uhtred knowing that the result would mean war. As the years wore on, and the fire of his youth began to wane, Hastein was described as a lusty and terrifying old warrior, a man who had outlived countless foes, but whose fearsome spirit had never dimmed. He was one of the most notorious Vikings of all time, having raided dozens of cities across many kingdoms in Europe, the Mediterranean, and North Africa, navigated the seas of most of the known world during his time, and being the veteran of 100 battles. This is his story. Magellan TV is a documentary streaming service created by filmmakers, offering one of the richest collections of historical content, with over 4,000 documentaries covering history, nature, true crime, art, culture, and much more. Personally, I've been watching Ancient Warriors, a fascinating series about legendary fighting cultures. Episode 11 focuses on the Vikings, providing an in-depth look into the Viking Age, as well as their rise, reign, and eventual decline. The show explores various warrior societies, including the Celts, Assyrians, and Normans, as well as many more, and is perfect for history buffs like me, eager to learn more about ancient warrior cultures. Magellan TV has become a staple of my holiday routine, offering a great escape during quiet winter nights. Watching Ancient Warriors has been thoroughly enjoyable, especially as I'm able to explore the motivations of ancient soldiers and how they lived, fought, trained, died, and changed the world. This gave me further insight into today's topic of the Viking legend Hastein. History Profile viewers get their first month for just 99 cents, or enjoy 50% off an entire year. Don't wait. Click the link in the description to dive into the world of amazing documentaries on Magellan TV. The early life of Hastein remains shrouded in mystery, with few records to illuminate his origins. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle identifies him simply as a Dane, offering little more than this brief reference to his heritage. However, a more enigmatic account is presented by the 11th century chronicler Raoul Glaber, who suggests that Hastein may have been born in the lands of Pas de Trois, in what is now modern-day France. This claim, though intriguing, stands in contrast to other sources that clearly mark him as a Scandinavian. Historian Michael Dillange proposes a possible reconciliation of these conflicting accounts. In around the year 800, Emperor Charlemagne, in his efforts to quell rebellion in Saxony, relocated many Saxons and Danes to Christian lands. It is conceivable that Hastein was born in the early 9th century to one of these displaced families. Raised in a foreign land, he may have later uncovered his Scandinavian roots, perhaps through family law or ancestral discoveries, which would have prompted his eventual return to the north. There, he would rise to prominence, eventually becoming a ship captain and a leader of Viking warriors. Another theory is that Hastein could have been a son of the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok, making him a brother to the formidable Björn Ironside. Yet, this remains unlikely, a claim perhaps made by Hastein himself to gain prestige in the Viking world. Alternately, his true parents may have simply been lost to the ravages of time, forever obscured in the fog of history. Thus, the origins of Hastein remain a mystery, with competing theories offering glimpses into the past, but none providing a definitive answer. Whether born among the Saxons, the Danes, or the bloodline of Ragnar, there is speculation that Hastein was born in around the year 810, and he is credited with being involved with various raids on the Frankish Empire. His rise to fame in the Viking world, however, began in the year 859, where Hastein jointly led an expedition with Björn Ironside. A number of Frankish, Norman, Arab, Scandinavian and Irish sources mention a large Viking raid into the Mediterranean in the years 859 to 861, co-led by Hastein and Björn Ironside. William of Jumièges, a monk born in the year 1000, offers a fascinating glimpse into the motivations behind this grand venture. According to William, Hastein conceived a bold idea: to place Björn Ironside upon the throne of the Roman Empire, becoming a ruler of the lands of the Mediterranean. Together, they forged a plan to raid the coasts of the ancient world, bringing both riches and glory to their Viking horde. It was a plan that would prove to be as daring as it was dangerous, and one that would set the course for a legendary campaign. The Vikings set sail from the Loire, the longest river in France, aboard a formidable fleet of 62 ships, each one swift and deadly. The dragon-headed longships were designed for both speed and manoeuvrability, and were ideal for raids upon distant shores, enabling the Vikings to strike quickly. Their first target was the Iberian Peninsula, where the Vikings capitalized on the relative weakness of the Christian kingdoms and the ongoing strife between the local rulers and the Muslim Saracens. In the year 859, the kingdom of Asturias, located in what is now northern Spain, was ruled by King Ordoño I, a monarch embroiled in a relentless war against the Saracens. These Muslim invaders had swept across the Iberian Peninsula since the year 711, leaving destruction in their wake as they established a powerful Islamic state that stretched across much of Spain. As the Vikings landed on the coast of Asturias, they were met with little resistance and quickly set about raiding the region. However, their initial success was met with a challenge. The local Christian forces led by Count Don Pedro of Asturias gathered their strength and launched a counterattack, defeating the Vikings in a bloody skirmish. Despite suffering heavy losses, Hastein and Björn were undeterred. They turned their focus towards the Saracens themselves, raiding their strongholds and engaging in a series of bloody skirmishes and sieges. One of the most glorious and audacious raids on their campaign took place in the Emirate of Córdoba, a powerful Arab Islamic state that controlled much of southern Spain. In a remarkable display of their fighting prowess, Hastein and Björn besieged the city of Algeciras, a major port on the southern tip of the Iberian Peninsula. For 3 days, they laid siege to the city, their forces overwhelming the defenders. After eventually taking the city, they looted the homes of the wealthy, and in an act of utter defiance, still worshipping the Norse gods of old, the Vikings set fire to the mosques in the city. With their raid now complete, they amassed great wealth in gold, silver, and slaves, goods they would later sell or use to fuel their ongoing Mediterranean campaign. Emboldened by their success, Hastein and Björn turned their sights southward, venturing across the narrow Strait of Gibraltar to strike at the heart of North Africa. The Vikings sailed to the coast of modern-day Morocco and Algeria, where they targeted the Idrisid dynasty. a Muslim kingdom ruled by the descendants of the Prophet Muhammad. The Vikings ravaged coastal cities, looting them for treasure and taking prisoners who would later be sold into slavery. The raids against the Saracens continued with devastating efficiency. Hastein and Björn's fleet struck terror into the hearts of the Muslim rulers, plundering cities along the coast of what is now Tunisia and Algeria. Their rampage continued eastward to the Balearic Islands, where they laid waste to the islands of Majorca and Minorca, and further to the eastern Mediterranean, where they seized the coastal town of Orihuela. The campaign also took them to the town of Neckel, where they established a temporary base, and held the town for a period of 8 days. During this time, they further cemented their reputation as ruthless raiders, seizing wealth and slaves while striking fear into the hearts of the local populace. The next targets were the wealthy cities in southern France, where they wreaked havoc, looting treasures and taking prisoners. However, the Vikings would soon set sail towards Italy. In their relentless pursuit of wealth, glory, and eternal renown, Björn Ironside and the cunning Hastein set sail along the rugged Italian coastline. Their eyes were fixed on Luni, a town that, with its crumbling ruins and grandiose architecture, had once been a beacon of power and splendour. To the Viking raiders, however, its decaying stone walls and towering monuments held a promise greater than mere riches. They believed that they had found the fabled city of Rome itself, the heart of the ancient world. The town, a centre for marble mining in its prime, had long since lost its importance. Now a quiet village of stone and dust, with only the faintest echoes of its past grandeur. Hastein, ever the strategist, knew that brute force alone would not win the day. He could see the imposing walls of the town and recognised that a frontal assault would be fruitless. Instead, he devised a plan so devious and cunning that it would go down in the annals of Viking legend. He knew the town's religious zeal would be their weakness. Under the guise of a dying man seeking redemption, Hastein ordered his men to carry him to the town gates on a stretcher, his body feigned to be on the verge of death. The guards allowed them entry, and word quickly spread that the Viking warlord sought to embrace Christianity before his final breath. And moved by the belief in redemption, the townspeople ushered him into the church. Once inside, Hastein was presented to the sacred rites of the Christian faith, receiving the sacraments in the eyes of the town's clergy. But this was no humble man seeking salvation. In a moment of divine mockery, Hastein leaped from his stretcher, he rallied his men, and in the blink of an eye, they descended upon Luni like wolves upon a flock of sheep. The town was sacked in a frenzy of violence, riches were stolen, homes were burned, and the once proud church was desecrated. Another account claims that Hastein's ruse was even more elaborate, claiming that he would embrace Christianity on his deathbed, only to feign death the following day. The townsfolk, fooled by his pretense, allowed him and 50 of his men draped in robes to enter the church for his supposed burial. But as the funeral rites began, Hastein sprang from his coffin, his sword flashing through the air, and with a single swift strike, he decapitated the priest, sending shockwaves of fear throughout the town. In a brutal moment of triumph, the Viking raiders unleashed their fury upon Luni, sacking the city and its treasures. Yet, the story of this raid takes an unexpected turn. As Hastein stood amidst the chaos, claiming victory over the mighty Rome, the townspeople corrected him. The city he had conquered was not Rome, it was Luni, a shadow of the empire he sought to claim. Enraged by this humiliation, Hastein's wrath erupted. He ordered the slaughter of every male resident and the capture of many women and children who would become his slaves. His victory, once glorious, became a tale of brutal vengeance. The Vikings would then sail along the Italian coast. They put their sights on the city of Pisa, where their longships wreaked havoc upon the city's walls, and they would begin to plunder it. However, as the fleet made its way back to the Loire, fate dealt them a cruel blow. A violent storm tore through the Viking fleet, and they were forced to abandon nearly 40 of their ships to the sea's mercy. 2 more vessels were lost on the Straits of Gibraltar. Despite this, Hastein pressed on, his fleet battered but still formidable, and he would turn his attention to the city of Pamplona. There, the Vikings struck once more, raiding the city with terrifying precision. Hastein would even capture their king, Garcia Inúñez of Pamplona, holding him captive for a hefty ransom. The price for the king's release was 70,000 gold dinars, a coin of immense value in the medieval Islamic world. With their coffers brimming with gold, slaves and spoils of war, Hastein and his warriors made their way home. The riches they accumulated and their deeds in foreign, faraway lands would become the stuff of legend. But this wasn't the end for Hastein. In the fateful year of 866, a momentous alliance was forged between Solomon the Duke of Brittany and the Viking commander Hastein. Their combined forces set out on an ambitious expedition. As the Viking horde swept across the western coast, they descended upon the city of Le Mans, situated in the northwest of France. Le Mans, once a vibrant city, was sacked, its wealth and splendour falling to the will of Hastein, a man that had raided countless cities. However, the devastation of Le Mans did not go unnoticed. Robert the Strong, a valiant commander of the Frankish forces, who had long defended the northern regions of Francia, rose to the challenge. With an army assembled from the surrounding lands, Robert sought to repel the Viking scourge that threatened to encircle his kingdom. He led his troops with unyielding resolve, determined to expel the raiders from the rich lands of western Francia. This would result in the Battle of Brissac. In this battle, the Frankish army succeeded in intercepting the Danes before they could retreat to the safety of their ships. The Vikings, realizing the tide of battle was turning, attempted to seek refuge in a nearby church, hoping the walls of the holy place would shield them from the fury of the Frankish forces. But Robert the Strong, ever resolute, was determined to end the Viking threat once and for all. He ordered a siege of the church, encircling the building and cutting off the invaders' escape. Trapped within the church, the Viking commander found himself in a perilous position with no clear escape route. Yet, in the chaos of the siege, Hastein's resourcefulness shone through. As Robert removed his armour to better oversee the siege, the Vikings, in a sudden and unexpected move, launched a fierce counterattack. The Franks were caught off guard, and in the ensuing melee, Robert the Strong was struck down in the heat of battle, his life extinguished. The loss of their leader threw the Frankish forces into disarray. With their commander dead and their morale shattered, the Franks had no choice but to retreat, leaving the Vikings victorious once more. Emboldened by this success, Hastein and his warriors continued to ravage several parts of Francia for many more years. Yet, despite the continuing wave of Viking conquest, a fragile peace settled over the region. The relentless cycle of bloodshed and pillaging slowed, and for a brief time, the Viking forces withdrew. But peace, as always, proved to be fleeting. The Frankish king Charles the Bald, fearing the loss of more territory, mobilized his forces. Hastein, ever the seasoned Viking commander, made a fateful decision. Recognizing the shifting tides of power in Francia, and knowing that his land was no longer secure, he turned his gaze across the seas, towards the land of England. It was there, amid the turmoil and strife of a fractured kingdom, that Hastein and his warriors saw the promise of riches and plunder beyond imagination. The law of England, with its vast wealth and unguarded shores, became a new beacon for Hastein's ambitions. In the year 892, Hastein embarked upon an ambitious campaign to invade England. crossing the channel from Boulogne with one of two great Viking fleets. Leading the smaller of the two, his forces numbering 80 ships, landed on the shores of Kent, occupying the royal village of Milton Regis near Sittingbourne. His allies, with a much larger fleet of 250 ships, disembarked at Appledore. Yet, England, once a fractured land, had been united under the leadership of Alfred the Great. By this time, Wessex had risen to become the dominant kingdom in the British Isles, and Alfred, having successfully united the kingdoms of Northumbria and East Anglia under his overlordship, stood resolute in defence of his realm. As the Viking armies encroached upon the southern shores, Alfred swiftly gathered his forces. He positioned his army strategically between Hasten's smaller company and the larger Viking force, effectively preventing them from joining forces. In response, Hastein, ever the pragmatist, sought to avoid an all-out conflict, and thus agreed to come to terms with Alfred. One of these conditions was the baptism of his two sons, a symbolic act of peace. With these terms in place, Hastein withdrew from Kent, moving his forces to Essex. But the peace would not last. The larger Viking army, having raided Hampshire and Berkshire, sought to reunite with Hastein. However, their efforts were thwarted, as they were decisively defeated at the Battle of Farnham by an army led by Edward, Alfred's son. The survivors, battered but not broken, eventually made their way to Mersey Island in Essex, where they reunited with Hastein's forces. A combined army of Wessex and Mercian soldiers would soon launch a siege against the fortress Hastein had established at Benfleet in Essex. The Viking stronghold, built with Hastein's considerable wealth and cunning, was considered impregnable. Its stout walls and well-fortified defences withstood the relentless efforts of the allied forces. The Vikings, safe in the fortress walls, continued their raids in Mercia from this base. Yet, despite the strength of his fortress, Hastein's hold on Essex was not completely secure. While his main forces were out raiding, those left behind in the fort were overwhelmed by the militias of eastern Wessex, bolstered by Alfred's troops. The entire fortress was eventually lost, along with the families of the Viking raiders, including Hastein's own wife and children, who were captured along with their ships. It was a devastating blow to the Viking leader. But Hastein was not one to surrender easily. He swiftly regrouped, relocating his forces to eastern Essex, where he began constructing a new fortress. He also called for reinforcements from the Danish kingdoms of East Anglia and York, bolstering his ranks in preparation for further conflict. The situation grew even more tense as the Vikings sought to regain their lost ground and exact revenge for the defeat they had suffered. In the midst of this struggle, Hastein sought to negotiate once more with Alfred. According to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, Hastein and Alfred held talks with the goal of securing the release of his family. The outcome of the talks proved to be a significant turning point. Hastein's two sons, who had been baptized earlier that year, were returned to him as a sign of goodwill. The baptisms had been a crucial part of a prior negotiation, with King Alfred and Ethelred, the Lord of the Mercians, acting as godfathers to the boys. However, although Hastein's sons were now Christian, that would not stop him from pursuing more land and more wealth. Thus, the stage was set for the continuation of the struggle between the forces of Wessex and the Viking raiders. Hastein's quest for wealth, power, and glory in England would continue. The negotiations between Hastein and Alfred the Great ultimately yielded little for the kingdoms of Wessex and Mercia, for Hastein would break his word. Not long after the peace agreement, Hastein, ever relentless in his pursuit for wealth, launched a second devastating raid across England. His forces first ravaged the Thames Valley, then swept westward along the River Severn. The Viking onslaught was met with swift retaliation, as Ethelred, Lord of the Mercians, rallied a combined army of Wessex, Mercia, and even the warriors from the Welsh kingdoms. This formidable force pursued the Danes and trapped them at a place called Buttington. This would result in the Battle of Buttington. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle recounts the desperation of the Viking defenders, stating, "After many weeks had passed, some of the heathens died of hunger, but some, having by then eaten their horses, broke out of the fortress and joined battle with those who were on the east bank of the river. In the ensuing chaos, the Vikings fought valiantly, but the Christians, Wessex, and Welsh forces emerged victorious. Thousands of Viking warriors fell in battle, and many more were put to flight. Hastein, however, was not among the fallen. In the aftermath of the slaughter, he managed to escape the carnage and withdraw to the east. There, he found refuge in the ruined Roman fortress at Chester, located in East Anglia. By the year 893, he was determined to rebuild the fortifications and use this site as a base for further raids into northern Mercia. Yet, the Mercians, still reeling from the Viking threat, were resolute in their defence. They laid siege to the fortress, cutting off Hastein's supplies and destroying the region's crops and livestock, hoping to starve the Vikings into submission. Unable to maintain their position, Hastein's forces abandoned Chester and crossed into North Wales. However, their situation grew increasingly dire as they found themselves deprived of their plundered cattle and grain. Turning back towards Northumbria, they sought to evade their pursuers. After several days of evading the English forces, they eventually arrived at Mersey, an island off the eastern shore of Essex, where they established a new base. In the following months, the Viking raiders continued their campaign, looting and pillaging the southern counties. Their violent incursions eventually brought them into conflict with the people of Chichester, who mounted a defence against the marauders, putting them to flight and slaying many of them. The English forces also captured several of the Danes' ships, adding another blow to Hastein's already stretched resources. Despite these setbacks, Hastein's forces continued their relentless campaign, moving up the Thames and the River Lee, seeking to re-establish their dominance. In the summer of the year 894, the Vikings fortified their position along the Lee, constructing a fortress roughly 20 miles from London. Word of their new stronghold spread quickly, and soon a large force of townsmen and soldiers gathered to confront the invaders. Yet, once again the Vikings proved their mettle, putting the English forces to flight and slaying 4 of the king's thanes in the process. Despite this victory, Hastein and his men remained vulnerable to the might of the English. Realizing the precariousness of their position, Alfred the Great devised a clever strategy to block the Vikings across the river. He ordered the construction of 2 fortresses on either side of the Lee, effectively sealing the Vikings in. When the Danes realized they could no longer access the river or their ships, they abandoned the fortress and attempted to flee. However, the English forces were in hot pursuit, and the Vikings were eventually forced to retreat to Bridgenorth by the Severn, where they constructed yet another fortress. Despite their continued resistance, they were now clearly on the defensive. As the winter of the year 894 set in, the Viking army settled in Bridgenorth, their movements restricted by the relentless English pressure. And by the year 896, with their options dwindling, the Viking raiders began to disperse. Some made their way to East Anglia, while others journeyed northward to Northumbria. Those without means to continue the fight found ships and sailed south, leaving England for a time. Thus, the once mighty Viking force that had threatened to fracture the very foundation of the English kingdom ultimately fell short of its goal. Hastein's army once a formidable threat, eventually scattered and faded into obscurity. By around the year 896, Hastein, now an elderly man, disappeared from the pages of history, having already earned a reputation as the lusty and terrifying old warrior of the Somme. He lived a life filled with conflict, conquest and bloodshed. Though his name would echo in the tales of the sagas, the fate of Hastein remains shrouded in mystery, his final years unrecorded, his end uncelebrated. Hastein carved his name into the world's memory as one of the most notorious and successful Vikings of all time. He raided cities and kingdoms across Europe, from the shores of France to the lands of North Africa. However, his legend was not one without controversy. The Picard monk Dudo of St. Quentin offered a scathing assessment of the man who had once commanded armies that struck fear into the hearts of kings and nobles alike. He said, "This was a man accursed, fierce, mightily cruel and savage, pestilent, hostile, sombre, given to outrage and untrustworthy, insolent, fickle and lawless, death-dealing, uncouth, fertile in ruses, warmonger general, traitor, fomenter of evil, and a double-dyed dissimulator." Hastein was seen through Dudo's eyes as a figure who thrived on violence and treachery, a master of deceit and disruption. While it is possible that he was a man in his 70s or 80s when he died, a man of his age and renown would not have been an anomaly in the Viking world. Contemporaries such as Rollo and the Viking who would later become the founder of the Duchy of Normandy, and King Harald Fairhair, the first king of Norway, also lived comparably long lives. Hastein's endurance on the battlefield, combined with his ability to navigate dangerous political and military landscapes of his time, suggests a man who was remarkably successful in his pursuit of wealth and power. Though Hastein was never a king, nor did he succeed in his ultimate goal of subjugating the kingdoms within England, his name lived on as a symbol of the Viking way of life. His exploits inspired countless tales, songs and sagas, immortalizing his deeds in the collective memory of the Viking world. He lived the true Viking life, raiding, pillaging, and leading multiple expeditions across the seas. Although time may have faded the details of his final years, his legendary exploits endure, and Hastein will always be remembered as one of the greatest, albeit forgotten Vikings to ever sail the seas. I hope you all enjoyed the video. If you did, be sure to like, subscribe and share, and I'll see you all soon for another History Profile.